Hello and welcome to our first chapter in our journey through the Old Testament. In this chapter, we're going to see little snippets of what we're going to see for the rest of the semester on various stories that were handed down from our Hebrew ancestors and their experience in the revelation of God. As Catholics, this is very important to us as we get an opportunity to see the laws for which Jesus taught from, the tradition from which he lived, and the correlation of his life against the prophecy of the Messiah. My hope is that as we continue this journey through the Old Testament, that you will continue to take notes on these presentations so that it'll help you complete the assignments, assessments, and otherwise class activities more efficiently. If you have any questions as you go through your studies, please do not hesitate to stop and see me at any time. The beauty of doing class in this format is that you can rewind, pause, or re-listen to any of the lecture at any time. This will help you in your note-taking skills. So let's begin. The Bible is essentially a collection of books. Jesus and the early Christians saw God as the first author of the Scripture. The Old Testament, also known as OT, is not one book, but a collection of different books written by human authors at different times, and includes different types of literature. And despite the fact that the Jews and Protestants and Catholics have different views of the Old Testament, the basic subject of the Old Testament is the same. And it's a look at God's role in shaping human events. We understand as Christians that the Old Testament also prepares for and declares in prophecy the coming of Christ, our Redeemer, and draws that parallel for us so that he may save all of humankind. But overall, the one thing to remember, as the Bible is a collection of books, this is true, however, the subject of all the books is the same. It's God's role in shaping all human events. Jews, Catholics, and Protestants differ in the number of books they include in their version of the Old Testament. Catholics believe that there are 46 books in the Old Testament, while Jews and Protestants include 39. And as we start to go through the list, we'll tell you which ones are included in the Catholics versus the Jews and Protestants version. The first collection of the Old Testament involved the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Known as the Torah, from the Hebrew meaning law, also known as the Pentateuch, from the Greek meaning 5 books. These 5 books provide various accounts of the creation of the world, stories of the ancestors of the Jews, early Israelite history, and ends with the codes of Jewish law. The next collection we're going to take a look at are the historical books. They give an account of Jewish history from the conquest of Canaan to the kingdom of the Maccabees. The books here that are included are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 King and 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, the book of Tobit, which is not included in the Jewish or Protestant Old Testament. Neither is the book of Judith. Esther. We also have the 1st Maccabees and 2nd Maccabees in our historical books. Those are left out of the Protestant and Jewish Old Testament as well. My personal favorite is the book of Tobit. That's the only book in the Bible that you're going to find the story of the Archangel Raphael. It's a very interesting story, and I encourage you to take a look if you have a free moment to read that. It's not a very long book, but it's a very intriguing story of how that archangel was able to help Tobias. Next up in our collection are the wisdom books. The wisdom books are full of poetry about religion and love, as well as collections of wise sayings, and the book of Job. And Job is about a moral drama that examines the mystery of why and the innocent suffer. Included here in the wisdom books are the Book of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Wisdom of Solomon, and Sirach. The Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach are two more books that are left out of the Protestant and Jewish Testaments. The last structure of the Old Testament, and our last collection that we're going to discuss in our tour, are the prophetic books. These books include a bunch of sermons and visions of a group of Jewish religious reformers known as the prophets. They worked hand in hand with the kings of the kingdom. These prophets include Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Baruch, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The only one that's not included in the Testament of the Jewish and Protestant tradition is the Book of Baruch. The biggest question about the Old Testament is, where did it come from? What are the sources of information for the Old Testament? Well, a lot of that history relies on both what they call oral and written sources. Oral tradition existed before the invention of writing, and it continued after for some degree. For oral tradition, historical chronicles and genealogies or laws or any other kind of cultural stories are memorized and then passed down from one generation to the next. There's a lot of striking evidence that can complex records or that can be preserved by oral tradition because it can be a little skewed from time to time. However, the basic moral story remains the same. For example, if you look at the story of Genesis, there are essentially two stories of creation that were handed down through oral tradition. Yet both of them are similar in many, many different ways. Both focus on the number of days in which the Lord created the earth, 6, and the fact that he rested on the seventh day. The fact that there's man and woman, known as Adam and Eve, and the serpent who tempted them with original sin. Then, of course, we have written tradition. Written sources for the Old Testament were letters or memoirs or palace or temple records or reports of settlements or military campaigns or any other thing that was written down to record history. And a combination of these events, along with oral tradition, can somehow stabilize this idea that God revealed himself through this collection of books known as the Old Testament. It was believed that the original audience of the Old Testament were the Israelites. It was believed that their ancestors had entered a special relationship with God, also known as a covenant. The Old Testament was intended to serve as a guide for people on how to live as God's people. And they told these stories through tales, poetry, by handing down laws, sermons, proverbs. Anything that you could eventually include in the Old Testament was intended for you to learn God's providence and to serve as a guide for those Israelites on how to live and remain God's people. Now, the Christians view the Old Testament as a history of their faith. The early Christians were all Jewish, so they were all very familiar with the Old Testament. They were either read the Old Testament when they went to worship, or they themselves were scholars or priests that read the scriptures to the people. The value and the lessons of the Old Testament provide universal truths of human experience and still apply today to people of all religions and even those people with no religion. As mentioned previously, there were various literary forms and techniques used to comprise the Old Testament. Some were basically informational, such as histories, genealogies, and law. And other Old Testament works were literary in nature. They used a various amount of forms. It could be an origin of story, so an explanation of how something came to be. A short story, which is a type of brief narrative which characters and the plots are fully developed. You'll see this a lot in the books of Ruth, Esther, and Jonah. An epic is a detailed history of a hero who demonstrates both bravery and wisdom and goes through the series of different trials in order to prove themselves. Then when there's imagery, Imagery refers to the concrete sensory details that make a literary work vivid and realistic, so the words literally jump off the page to you. They use figures of speech, which are comparisons that are meant to be taken for you to imagine in your own minds, rather than for what they really happened, or how they may have really happened. Parallelism. The most evident feature of the Old Testament poetry is parallelism, which involved the repetition of words and phrases, or at least the repetition of a thought or patterns. And then there's irony. Irony is a literary technique that's used. What is said or done is contrary to what is expected. For example, I'd kill for a Nobel Peace Prize, as your book points out. Now, obviously, a person wouldn't really kill themselves if they're trying to achieve world peace, or kill anyone if they're trying to achieve world peace. Another example, as the book points out, is Genesis chapter 18, where 3 heavenly visitors announced to Abraham that he and his aged wife will have a son. Sarah, who is listening, laughs to herself as an improbable event because she's tried to have children and they were never blessed. So she doesn't think it's possible. As a matter of fact, she finds it quite humorous.